everybody, welcome to my channel. My name's Mel. Thank you so much for joining me today for my second genre wrap-up. Okay, so today we are doing a wrap-up. Now some of you may know that I recently decided that I was actually going to trial run doing slightly different wrap-ups. So rather than being a monthly wrap-up, I'm going to be doing genre wrap-ups. So the last wrap-up that I did, which I will link in the description below and in the eye up above, was the wrap-up for magical realism, fantasy, science fiction, fabulism in general. This wrap-up is going to be my literary, historical, contemporary and classic fiction wrap-up, and any time that I have non-fiction will also come in here, although I don't actually have any non-fiction today to talk about. And then my next wrap-up will be thriller, mystery, dark academia and gothic. So how exactly is all this going to work? Well, I do know that obviously there are various different subgenres, so I'm just going to go with the genre that I think this book falls into the most. Although today we do have a couple of exceptions to that rule, but I'll explain that at the very end. Anyway, so because this is the second of these sorts of wrap-ups that I'm doing, most of the books that I have read that fit into these categories are from July. Some of you may know that in July was the Indie Accords readathon, so this was a readathon that aimed at reading independently published and also self-published books. I was very kindly asked to be the team leader for historical, contemporary and literary fiction for the Indie Accords, so I read predominantly from those three genres. I also read predominantly independently published books. So thank you Liane, who is the runner of the Indie Accords readathon and also the channel Lore and Lullabies and also the blog Lore and Lullabies. So I will link all of that information in the description below if you want to go and check that out. We had a lot of fun doing the readathon. I had a great deal of fun doing the readathon, so thanks again Liane. So most of the books that I want to talk to you about today were from July, were from that readathon, but I do have one book that I did read in June because it fitted into this genre rather than the genre that I talked about at the end of June, which was fantasy, etc. As we go through and we've had more months since I started doing this, which was last month, then it'll become more clear what I'm doing. But for now, it's mostly looking like a monthly wrap-up, but that's okay. These things happen. Before I go into all of the books, you guys probably know, if you've been around for any length of time, I do tend to ramble. I do have quite a few books to talk about today, so I'm going to try really hard to keep it relatively short and succinct. Wish me luck. Alright, so the first book that I want to talk to you about today is What Alice Forgot by Liane Moriarty. This is a contemporary chick lit fiction. So this follows Alice. Now Alice is a, I think, late 30s woman who has some kind of accident in the gym, and she wakes up to discover that she has forgotten the last 10 years of her life. So she wakes up and she thinks that she's in her late 20s, she's pregnant, she's about to have a baby, but it turns out that she's actually in her late 30s. She is going through a divorce, she's not pregnant, she's already got 3 children. It's about her trying to live her life and try to fit into this new life and fit into this new person that she is and figure out how she got from where she thought she was in her late 20s to where she currently is in her late 30s and navigate that, but also at the same time trying to figure out what's happened to her. The doctors can't find anything that's wrong. There doesn't seem to be any explanation for why she has this memory loss. So that's the basic storyline for this one. I'm trying not to give any spoilers for what happens throughout the book. Okay, so what did I think of the book? I'm just having a look at my core pile sheet and I gave it 6.86 on core pile, which translates to 3 stars. So it wasn't my favourite Liane Moriarty book. I have given higher star ratings to some of her other books, but I did still really enjoy it. One of the things that I absolutely love about Liane Moriarty's writing style is the way that she writes characters. So I really appreciate the way that she writes really well-rounded, really believable characters. They're not always nice, they're not always particularly likable, but they are believable, and that's something that I really appreciate. This particular character, Alice, is not particularly likeable. I don't mind that in a book. I don't necessarily feel like I need to have likeable characters all the time, and I did appreciate that I could still understand what was happening for this character, and I could still feel for the character even though I didn't necessarily particularly like her personality or everything about her. But the main reason that I didn't give this as high a rating as I have given some of Liane Moriarty's other books is that I'm not 100% sure about the way that she's portrayed a couple of the different experiences that some of the people in the story is having. So Alice herself is suffering from some kind of amnesia. Like I said, it's very unclear in the book what the actual medical sort of situation is. So it's difficult to really know how realistic that portrayal is. However, because I'm not experienced that, and I haven't actually thus far read any own voices conversation around that, I don't really know how, like I said, what the portrayal is like and how realistic the portrayal even was in this book. However, there was another character, her sister, who is experiencing some difficulties with infertility and some difficulties with IVF and having a successful pregnancy. Most of that was written reasonably well, and I thought the portrayal of that experience was quite believable, but there were a few aspects which I wasn't entirely sold on. Now, having said that, obviously, everybody's experience of something like infertility and indeed something like amnesia are very different, so it's not like I can sit here and say that's not been my experience, so therefore that's completely wrong. However, because it didn't ring entirely true from the IVF point of view, some of the ways that she was not so much the ways that she was experiencing it or the emotions she was having, but more some of the seeming medical side of things didn't feel like Liane Moriarty had necessarily done all the research that she could have done into the actual way that in Australia IVF is given and approached by members of the medical. So from that point of view, from the sort of more factual point of view, it didn't ring as true as it could have done, and so that made me feel less certain about how she was dealing with the amnesia side of things and the medical way that the medical industry would have actually dealt with that situation. So, I mean, it is a story and it's not, it's not a handbook of what happens when you have amnesia or you're going through IVF or anything like that. So it's not like I can necessarily expect that that would be 100% accurate in terms of what a medical pamphlet might be. However, I found that I wasn't 100% convinced, so yeah, it just knocked down some of the rating for me. So yeah, so that was Liane Moriarty's What Alice Forgot. I should have checked what my battery was doing before I started filming, because I now have to go and change my battery, so I'll be back in a second. So, the next book that I want to talk to you about is The Rain Heron by Robbie Arnott. This is a literary fiction book and it's set in Australia. Well, it's set in a post-apocalyptic place that rings very much like Australia. The author is Australian, so my assumption is that it's set in Australia. Like I said, it's literary. We follow a few different points of view, one of which is Ren, who sort of somewhere in her sort of 40s or 50s, and she has chosen to go and live in a very remote part of whatever country we're in and live a little bit like a hermit. We then also follow a medic in the army, and we finally follow a soldier in the army as well. So we get quite a bit of their history and their childhood stories leading up to the present day. They do end up entwining together, but only in connection with the Rain Heron. Now, the Rain Heron is a mythical, but not quite mythical creature who is a heron that is essentially made out of water. So it is a real thing, but it has acquired quite a mythical, legendary status. It's believed to be kind of good luck. So we're following the soldier who is attempting to get access to the Heron. We're following the medic who is in her troop, and we're following Wren, who is a woman who, when she was a child, witnessed the rain heron, and so she has information that the soldier wants. That is as much as I'm going to tell you about the storyline of this one. I found it a little bit, I wouldn't say I found it difficult to follow, but I found it very meandering, and so it wasn't necessarily always particularly straightforward and particularly easy to follow. I did enjoy this one, but I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I was expecting to. The premise sounded really amazing, and like I said, I did enjoy it, but it just wasn't quite what I was expecting, and I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I was anticipating that I did, which is a little bit of a shame, but you know, that's okay. It's still a good book. On Core Pile, I gave it 6.86, which I just realised is exactly the same as I gave What Alice Forgot, so there you go. 6.86, which is 3 stars. So like I said, it was enjoyable, but it wasn't anything that blew me away or anything like that. And that was mostly, like I said, just that it was very meandering. I mean, it's literary fiction, and that's the sort of thing that you can often expect from literary fiction, which is usually not necessarily very linear, often quite rambly and meandering and random. This definitely lived up to that one, but I didn't necessarily feel like the stories intertwined as much as it seemed like it was going to, and certainly from the blurb that I read before I read the book, it seemed like the two main characters, the soldier and Wren, were going to have a lot more of a storyline together, which they really didn't. Not that that's necessarily a problem, it was more a matter of expectations than any difficulty with the work or anything. I do really like Robbie Arnott's writing style. It was, like I said, that it was very meandering, but it didn't feel overly written. It didn't feel like he didn't know what he was trying to say. He didn't overly describe or anything like that. He just kind of, you know, went along and told you a little bit of this story, and then he kind of went backwards, and then he went off to a tangent a little bit, but it all seemed to have a purpose. So from that point of view, I appreciated his writing style. And yeah, it was very what you'd expect from literary fiction, which I do enjoy literary fiction, but I think that I'm not sure exactly what I was expecting, but I think I was expecting something a little bit different, so I kind of let myself down more than necessarily the book, but there you go. Next up, we have Only Mostly Devastated by Sophie Gonzales. I read this one as a buddy read with Connor, and we both really, really enjoyed it. This is a contemporary retelling of the musical Grease. It is a queer retelling of the musical Grease. I have to say that initially, the fact that it was supposed to be a retelling of Grease kind of had me feeling a little bit uncertain about it, and I couldn't help but compare quite a bit in the first sort of, I guess, third of the book as I was reading it to what was going on in Grease. In some respects it is very similar, and in other respects it's quite different. I mean, first of all, the most obvious being that Grease is not queer, this is queer, but also in terms of when they were both written. Grease, I think, is 60s or 70s originally, and this one was published in 2020. So there's quite a bit of differences from that point of view. But initially, because I was doing the compare and contrast, it did mean that this book wasn't looking as I wasn't looking as favourably on the book as I could have been initially, in the beginning. Don't get me wrong, I know that Grease is somewhat problematic, but I kind of grew up with Grease in my teens, certainly, so it's just one of those things that it's got a lot of nostalgia for me. But once I kind of got used to what this story was doing, got used to where it was going, then I actually started to really, really enjoy it. So we follow our main character, Ollie. We come in at the end of his summer, and he's had a summer with his aunt. His mum and dad and himself have gone to stay with his aunt and his cousins and uncle in North Carolina, so he's originally from California. They've gone there because his aunt is very unwell with cancer, and so they've gone there to be there for her and to help out with the family. They've lived in this sort of holiday house on the shore of a lake, so it's kind of a last family holiday as well. And whilst he was there in the summer, he met a boy, Will, and they had a romance. So we come in at the end when the romance has not officially ended, but they're going back to school, so they've had to part ways. But Ollie is not actually returning to California as he thought he was. His family have decided that they're going to stay in North Carolina, and he ends up being enrolled in the same school as Will, as you would expect since it was a Grease retelling. And I ended up really enjoying this one. I really enjoyed the way that, again, Sophie Gonzales wrote characters. I really loved the character of Ollie. I thought that he was a really well-written, well-rounded, well-fleshed out character. I did actually like him as a character as opposed to Alice, who I didn't like. So I did actually like him as a character, but he wasn't without flaws. He was definitely well-rounded in that sense that, you know, he was a believable person. I also liked the character of Will, although he was less of a likeable character, but I liked the way he was written. And yeah, the rest of the characters I really enjoyed as well. I gave this one on Callpile 7.43, which translates to 4 stars. So this book deals with themes to do with grief and loss. It also deals with themes to do with coming out, to do with the different levels of where you are in your coming out story. I thought that was really well done, and I'll say again, I've said this a few times recently, I am not a Known Voices reviewer for pretty much anything, but certainly not for being queer and coming out or anything like that, so I can't speak to the representation from that perspective, but it did feel very real and authentic. Certainly the teenage voices felt very real and authentic, and I appreciated it from that point of view. I thought the themes were really well written and really well dealt with, so overall I really enjoyed this book and I would highly recommend that you read the book. The next book that I want to talk to you about is a children's classic, and that is Heidi by Johanna Spyri. This is such a sweet book. I really enjoyed this book. First of all, look at this cover. I think it's just gorgeous. This is the Puffin in Bloom edition of this book, and I'm attempting to collect all of these editions because they're just beautiful. So this is a story of a young orphan girl who, when she's 5 years old, is brought from her aunt who's been looking after her to her grandfather who lives very high up in the Swiss mountains. He's a grumpy old man who really doesn't have anything to do with the people around him or his family, and the aunt has run into a position where she's unable to care for Heidi any longer. So she takes Heidi up to the grandfather and tells him that she's his responsibility. And so Heidi is left to live with the grandfather, who actually is a very sweet old man who is very quiet and doesn't really say anything, but shows his love and affection for Heidi by, when she gets there, he has a table, he has a table and one chair, and then he builds another chair for her, and he shows her his affection in those sorts of ways. She completely falls in love with the mountain and living there, and she befriends a goat herd who travels up past the grandfather's house with all of the goats from the local village, and he picks up the grandfather's 2 goats and he travels up the mountain and then back down again every day in the summer. And so Heidi starts to go along with him, and she just has an amazing time. But then her aunt comes back, I think it's like 2 years later or something, because she's found a position for Heidi with this other young girl who lives in Germany, in Frankfurt, who is living with a physical disability in a wheelchair. So Heidi is taken to be the companion, but she makes really good friends with this girl and they get along really well, and that goes really well, but Heidi just doesn't cope very well with being away from her mountain. So she ends up being sent back to the grandfather, but then the girl and her grandmother come along a year or so later and stay with Heidi on the mountain, and the young girl starts to get better, and it's very kind of its time. It's very wholesome, it's very sweet, it's all about how Heidi loves the mountain, loves her grandfather, and needing the fresh Swiss air, and then the other young girl starts to get better because of the the fresh Swiss air and drinking milk straight out of the goats, basically. And, you know, it's all this sort of, that sort of storyline, but I did really enjoy it. It was just really sweet and a lot of fun to read. You may have seen my 12-hour reading challenge in which I read this book in that 12 hours. It's definitely very readable and a lot of fun to read, like I said. I gave this one 7.29 on Corpile, which is a 4-star rating. So I did, like I said, I really enjoyed the characterizations in this story as well. You really can see them in your brain as you're reading the book, and you can see the Swiss Alps, and you can see Heidi and Peter running around with the goats, and it's just one of those sorts of stories that's really immersive and just a really fun, really cute, enjoyable read. So I definitely highly recommend this one. The next book that I want to talk to you about is another middle grade that I read during July, and that is The Lady Grace Mysteries, and it's the first book, Assassin. This is a historical fiction novel that is told in a diary format, following a young girl who's, I think she's like 13 or 14, and she is one of the young girls who is in attendance to the Queen of England. She's very well off herself. She's a young lady, and she opens the diary talking about how she is supposed to be soon betrothed to someone. She has 3 suitors and she's trying to choose between them. She is a very well-off young lady, and so the suitors are potentially in it for the money, particularly given that 2 of them are quite a bit older than her. One is a little closer to her age, is in his early 20s. She's unsure. She doesn't really want to choose any of them, but it's time. So on the night that she is supposed to choose which of the suitors she would like to marry, they have a big party where she makes her choice. But the next day, one of the other suitors, or one of the ones that she didn't choose, is found dead, and the person who she did choose is accused of the murder. But Miss Grace doesn't believe that this has happened the way that it looks like it's happened, so she gets permission from the Queen on the down low to investigate what's actually happened. So it's a mystery with a young girl following the mystery, trying to solve the mystery. Kind of like Nancy Drew or Trixie Belden, but in a Elizabethan Queen's Court setting. I thought it was really fun. I thought it was, yeah, a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. I did like the character of Grace. I thought she was a very well written character. I really liked her spirit. She had a lot of spunk, and I really appreciated that. On Corpile, I gave this one a 6.86 as well, which is 3 stars. I also thought the pacing of the book was done really well because it's from a diary format. So we are looking at it through Grace's eyes, and we are looking at each day backwards, and I really I don't know, something about that I really appreciated. I thought it was really well done, and yeah, I just really enjoyed it. I thought it was a good time, so I would recommend this one as well. Alright, so next up we have another contemporary. This one is The Girl with Stars in Her Eyes by Zio Axelrod. This one we follow 2 points of view. So we follow Tony, who is a woman in her, I said, sort of mid-20s, and then we also follow Seb, who is in also probably mid to late 20s. So we're following Tony, and she is a, what's the word, session musician, but she also plays at a local bar in Philadelphia where she lives. Seb is a person who Tony grew up with, so when Tony was in her early teens, she moved towns, and the first person she ever met was Seb, and they had a very intense, very close friendship. She was also always pretty much in love with him. He never seemed to be. And then when he got to 18, I think she was 16, when he got to 18, he left town and just left without any word or anything. So it's been 8 years since that happened. She had never had an explanation. She never heard from him again. Didn't know what to do. They were supposed to leave town together, you know, all this sort of stuff. So when she is put in this position where he suddenly appears, as you can imagine, she's not very happy. Doesn't respond very well. However, he's now working for a really famous, or about to be really famous, a band on the cusp of sort of hitting the big time, and they are in need of a stand-in guitarist, and Tony's called in to be that stand-in guitarist, and as you can imagine, it goes from there. We have a potential romance, etc. I did enjoy this one. I thought that it was a lot of fun. This is really nitpicky, but I don't know what was going on, but whoever edited this, or perhaps whoever did the typesetting for this, there were a lot of typos in this and a lot of missed words, and I just, like I said, I know it's really nitpicky, but it did kind of pull me up short whenever it happened, and it's kind of a vaguely annoying thing. Now, if this book had been something that I was absolutely besotted with, then it would have been an incredibly minor annoyance. As it is, it's still a minor annoyance, but it was really noticeable to me. I did, like I said, enjoy the overall storyline, but I wouldn't say that it was the best written story. It felt quite formulaic, certainly from the point of view of the will they, won't they romance side of things. Some of the characterization of some of the characters, particularly in regards to the lilies, felt kind of quite formulaic, quite kind of tropey, which, you know, there's a place for that. Tropes are tropes for a reason, but it felt like the writer was writing to a caricature or to a trope rather than writing a character that just happened to have those character personality traits, if that makes sense. It just didn't hit right for me. It just didn't, yeah. It just didn't capture my attention as much as it could have done, and it just didn't hit as interestingly or as excitingly as it could have done, so I didn't love it. I did give it 6 on Pile, which is 3 stars as well. As you can see from all of the 6.14, 6.866, it's still a 3-star, still pretty standard in the middle of the road, but definitely on the lower end of the core pile. Overall, I thought the writing style was fine, although some of the sex scenes weren't, again, they were kind of just a bit flat. They felt like they were writing again to a formula of how sex scenes are supposed to be written, or how scenes that are sexy are supposed to be sexy. It didn't have a lot of heart, I didn't feel, so that kind of let me down a little bit as well. But yeah, like I said, it's 3 stars. I wouldn't say don't read it. I would recommend, if you like contemporary romance, easy to read, then I would recommend that you pick this book up. I'm glad I read it. I enjoyed the experience, but it's not going to stay with me. Next up, we have Starvation by Mollie Fennig. This is a young adult contemporary that was sent to me by the author, Mollie, in exchange for an honest review, so here we are. So this follows a young man called Wes. We are following 2 different timelines. We have before and after. So the after is sort of the present day, and the before is approximately a year, maybe a year and a half prior to the present day. So what we're talking about in this book is eating disorders and grief. We follow the 2 different timelines. Before is prior to the tragic death of Wes's older brother in a car accident, and then the after is a year or so later after Wes has had this experience. In the before, we see Wes meet a young woman whose name I've entirely forgotten, Kayla. We meet a young woman, Kayla, who has anorexia nervosa, and then we later in the after we discover that in the interim between when before happened and now, Wes has developed anorexia nervosa himself, and we are following the 2 different timelines to get an understanding of where it started and where we are in the present day. So in the present day, Wes has been hospitalised as a result of severe malnutrition and other complications due to his anorexia, and it's following post that hospitalisation. He's going into details about his life now and what his parents are trying, how his parents are trying to help him to start recovering and to start eating again, and his feelings around that, and how he experiences the psychological and physical and mental and emotional challenge of living with the anorexia. And then the before is prior to his brother's death, but also meeting Kayla and seeing her situation. I thought it was incredibly well done. Again, I am not a Known Voices reviewer, so I've not experienced an eating disorder, so I can't speak to representation side of things, but it did feel really respectful, it felt really in tune, it felt genuine, and it felt really well written, and I did enjoy this book, and I thought it was really, really interesting. I gave it 6.29 on Corpile, which again is 3 stars. The main thing that sort of brought down the rating for me was the ending. I would have appreciated more of a resolution. I didn't feel like we kind of got any indication of where Wes was going to go, but having said that, it did feel like snapshots from his life. So yeah. That was obviously an authorial choice, which is totally fine, but I personally would have appreciated a little bit more of a ending, really. The next book that I want to talk to you about is The Foxhole Court by Nora Sakavic. This book is quite a bit different from what I was anticipating. I don't really entirely know what I was anticipating. I kind of got the impression that it was a fantasy of some description. It is not. It is a contemporary novel. So we follow Neil, who is in his late teens, and he is a very good player of a made-up sport called Exy, and he gets drafted by, again, a made-up university to play with a scholarship for their varsity team called the Foxes. Now, the Foxes are a very interesting team in that all of them across the board are known to be have a lot of issues. They're known to be troubled teens who have quite traumatic backgrounds, and for some reason or another, which isn't entirely 100% explained, the coach of the team has decided to gather together a whole bunch of these sort of misfits, I guess, into this team and look after them in whatever way he can. So Neil is offered this position on the team. So we're following Neil as he starts in the summer, and he starts to practice with the team with the coach Kevin, but there's a lot more going on in this story than that particular synopsis would suggest. And I was surprised by how much I enjoyed this book. I listened to it on audiobook. I'm getting used to audiobooks. I'm kind of starting to find my way with audiobooks. Yeah, I don't necessarily gravitate towards audiobooks, but I downloaded this one on audio and I really, really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the narrator as well, who had a very interesting narration style, and not one that I would necessarily have appreciated, except that it really suited the storyline and the character of Neil. I don't want to give any spoilers, but there's a lot more in his background and in his upbringing, and we start to get little snippets of information about Neil and what he's been through and what his life has been like and will continue to be like throughout the story. And it's obviously very much leading towards some kind of quite big thing happening, quite an explosive event happening, but it didn't happen at the end of this book, so I clearly will need to read the rest of the series. I believe it's a 4-part series. But yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. I thought the pacing was really good. It seems predominantly, in terms of its sort of chapter by chapter, story by bit, it seems to be predominantly about this team and about this game and their interactions, but there's these snippets that keep you really engaged in Neil's story and really anticipating what's going to happen with him and the potential explosive ending that's going to occur. So I gave it 7.29 on Corpile, which is 4 stars. So those are all of the books that I want to talk to you about today. But I do just want to very quickly draw your attention to 2 other books that I read in July. And these are Deadly Misconduct by R.J. Amos and Dreaming Spies by Laurie King. The reason I'm drawing your attention to these, but I'm not going to actually talk about them yet, is that these two are very much kind of in the middle of two different genres. So this one is a contemporary which has a mystery element to the story as well, and this one is a historical / literary fiction that has a mystery element to the story as well. And I have realised that with my TBR for August and all of the books that I've been reading in the last couple of months, I really don't have very many books that I'll end up needing to talk about for my mystery, thriller, dark academia, gothic genre wrap-up. So I decided to leave the actual wrap-up and my sort of thoughts on these two until that one, because otherwise that would be very short and this would be significantly longer. So these two I would say that they are mostly more contemporary and mostly more historical literary, but because they have those other elements of mystery in them, I will leave them until next time. So that is the end of the genre wrap-up for the historical, contemporary, literary, classic and non-fiction wrap-up for the last couple of months. Let me know in the comments below if you have read any of these books and what you thought of them, or if you are planning on reading any of these books and what you think of that. Please also comment below if you let me know what you've read in the last couple of months. Is there any that fit into these genres? What did you think of them? If you would like to leave me a comment but you don't know what, then I would absolutely love it if you would leave me an emoji that kind of suggests historical fiction in some way. All of my social media details are in the description below, so if you'd like to go and find me on any of those other platforms, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much for watching. I really do hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would absolutely love it if you would subscribe to my channel and give this video a thumbs up. So yeah, like I said, thank you again so much for watching. I really do hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you next time.